There is a county in central Illinois where the planting season of 2022 will be remembered for a long time, not because the weather was particularly bad, not because the prices crashed, not because anything dramatic happened in the way that farming disasters usually happen, with storms you can see coming and floods that fill the low fields overnight. It will be remembered because of what happened on a Tuesday morning in April when 17 tractors stopped running at the same time. Not because they ran out of fuel, not because they broke down. They stopped because a company in a glass office building 1,100 miles away pushed a software update, and the machines decided they needed to verify it before they would move another inch. 17 tractors, parked in their fields, engines running, screens glowing, completely and perfectly unable to do the one thing a tractor is supposed to do: move forward through the soil. 16 of those tractors stayed parked for 4 days. The 17th one never stopped at all. It kept running all 4 days from sunup to past dark, cutting rows and turning ground while the other 16 sat waiting for permission from a satellite. And when those 4 days were over, the farmer driving that 17th tractor had planted more than half the county's spring crop by himself. His name was Earl Tatum. He was 67 years old. His tractor was a 1979 Oliver 8080. It had no computer. It had no GPS. It had no screen. It had a diesel engine, a set of worn hydraulic lines, and a steering wheel that Earl had been turning since he bought the machine used in 1984 for $3,800. The Oliver had no way of receiving a software update. It also had no way of being stopped by one. This is the story of those 4 days in April. But to understand those 4 days, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to a different April, 40 years earlier, when a young man in Illinois made a decision that the farming world thought was foolish. And you have to understand why that decision turned out to be the wisest thing anyone in that county ever did. Let me tell you about Earl Tatum. Earl was born in 1955 on the same farm he still works today. 160 acres of flat Illinois ground, the kind of ground that has been growing corn and soybeans since before the Civil War. His father farmed it. His grandfather farmed it. His great-grandfather broke the original sod with a walking plow that Earl still has hanging on the wall of his equipment barn, rusted now but still there, a reminder of where the land came from and what it cost to bring it into production. Earl grew up working that ground. He drove a tractor before he drove a car. He learned to read soil the way other children learn to read books, by the color of it, by the way it broke apart in your hands after a rain, by the smell of it in early spring when the frost was just coming out and the season was beginning again. He didn't need a yield monitor to tell him which parts of his field were productive. He knew because his father had showed him and his grandfather had showed his father, and the knowledge had been passed down the way all important knowledge is passed down, hand to hand, season to season. In 1978, Earl bought his first tractor. He was 23 years old and had saved every dollar from 4 harvests to do it. He went to the Oliver dealer in Decatur and bought a 1979 Oliver 8080. It was the last model year of that configuration, the last Oliver tractor built before the company was fully absorbed into white farm equipment. Earl didn't know that when he bought it. He bought it because it was what he could afford, and because the dealer, an old man named Harlan Peck, told him it was a machine that would last. Harlan was right. The Oliver 8080 had a 6-cylinder diesel engine producing 88 horsepower at the PTO. It had an 8-speed transmission, live hydraulics, and a power steering system that still worked smoothly 30 years after it was built if you maintained it the way it deserved to be maintained. It had no electronic components worth mentioning. No computer controlled anything on that tractor. Everything was mechanical, hydraulic, or purely electrical in the old sense. Switches and relays and wires that you could trace with your eyes and fix with your hands. Earl maintained it the way Harlan told him to. He changed the oil every year whether it needed it or not. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump in 1991 when it started to weep. He replaced the injectors in 2003. He put a new wiring harness on it in 2009 when the insulation on the old one started cracking from age. Every repair he did himself in his own barn with his own tools, Because Earl Tatum had learned from his father that a machine you can't fix yourself is a machine that owns you, not the other way around. The neighbors thought he was behind the times. By the mid-90s, everyone in that county was moving to John Deere. The green machines were everywhere, getting bigger and more sophisticated every year. GPS guidance came in, then yield monitors, then section control, then automatic headland turning, then telematics that sent data from the field to a computer at the dealer's office in real time. The farmers who bought these machines talked about them the way people talk about things they are proud of and a little bit frightened by at the same time, with a kind of reverence that made Earl uncomfortable. He went to one of those demonstrations in 2001. The dealer set up a new John Deere in a field outside of Decatur and let the farmers walk around it. It had a cab that felt like an airplane cockpit, screens everywhere, a joystick, GPS that could steer the tractor to within 2 inches of a straight line. The dealer's technician stood at the front and explained how the machine could practically drive itself, how all you had to do was set the parameters and the computer would handle the rest. Earl stood in the back of the crowd and listened. He asked one question. He said, "What happens when the GPS signal goes down?" The technician smiled. He said the signal was satellite-based and extremely reliable. He said outages were rare and short. He said the system had redundancies. Earl nodded. He drove his Oliver home. He didn't buy a new tractor that year. He didn't buy one the next year or the year after. While his neighbors were financing $200,000 machines and signing service contracts and agreeing to terms and conditions that were 40 pages long and written by lawyers, Earl was putting his money into the ground and keeping his old Oliver running. The neighbors thought he was stubborn. Some of them said he was afraid of technology. One of them, a man named Bert Hollander who farmed the 600 acres to the north, told Earl at the elevator one afternoon that he was going to get left behind. Bert said the future was precision agriculture. He said you couldn't compete without data. He said farmers who didn't upgrade were going to be squeezed out by the ones who did. Earl said, maybe so, and went back to work. This is the thing about Earl Tatum that the people who called him stubborn didn't understand. He wasn't against technology. He wasn't afraid of new things. He was a man who had been taught from childhood to read contracts before he signed them, to understand what he owned before he bought it, and to ask one simple question about every machine he put his faith in: can I fix this myself if it breaks? If the answer was yes, he was interested. If the answer was no, he moved on. Every John Deere he looked at after 2001, the answer was increasingly no. Not because the machines weren't good. They were extraordinary machines. But somewhere around 2010, Earl started noticing something that troubled him. The dealers were talking about software subscriptions, about data that belonged to the manufacturer, about, let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Repairs that had to be done by authorized technicians with proprietary diagnostic tools that farmers couldn't buy. He read an article in a farm magazine in 2012 about the right to repair, about how the new generation of agricultural equipment had software locks that prevented anyone but the dealer from accessing the control systems, about how a farmer whose tractor broke down during harvest could be waiting for a dealer technician for 3 or 4 days because the machine wouldn't let anyone else fix it. Earl read that article twice. He thought about his father's lesson, the one about owning your equipment and not being owned by it. He thought about Harlan Peck and the Oliver 8080 and the 40 years of repairs he'd done himself in his own barn. He kept Oliver. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you know that the stories we tell here are about more than tractors and fields. They are about the decisions that quiet people make when nobody is watching, and what those decisions look like 40 years later when the world catches up to them. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming, because what happened in April of 2022 is a story that every farmer in this country needs to hear. Now let me tell you about what changed in that county between 2010 and 2022. Because the change happens slowly, the most important changes happen, one purchase at a time, one harvest at a time, until one day you look at a county that used to have 60 independent family farming operations and you count 23. Bert Hollander was one of the ones who made it. He went from 600 acres to 1,800 acres, buying out 4 of his neighbors when they couldn't make the payments on their equipment. He had 7 John Deere tractors by 2020. The newest ones had GPS, telematics, section control, automated headland management, and a service contract with the dealer that ran $4,000 a year per machine. Bert thought this was efficiency. He thought he was farming the way farming was supposed to be done in the modern era. The county farm bureau meetings in those years had a particular feeling to them. The men with the new equipment talked about data and optimization and per-acre returns and variable rate application. They had charts on their phones showing yield maps that looked like satellite photography. They talked about the future with the confidence of people who believe they understand it. Earl Tatum sat in the back of those meetings the same way he'd stood in the back of the John Deere demonstration in 2001, and listened. He didn't say much. He was not a man who talked a great deal, but the farmers who knew him well enough to watch his face could see that he was always doing an accounting in his head, measuring what he heard against what he knew from 60 years of working the same ground in the same county. He asked one question at a Farm Bureau meeting in 2019. He said, "Has anyone here read the full terms of service on your equipment's software?" The room went quiet. One of the younger farmers, a man named Derek Voss, who had just bought a new $120,000 planter, said he had glanced at it. Earl said, "What does it say about software updates?" Derek said he thought updates were automatic, that the machine connected to the dealer's servers and received them as needed. Earl said, "Can you refuse an update?" Derek said he wasn't sure. Earl said, "Can you delay one?" Derek said he'd have to check. Earl nodded. He didn't say anything else. He drove home and went to his barn and put his hand on the hood of his Oliver the way his father used to put his hand on the hood of the Farmall M, feeling the cold metal, standing in the quiet of the barn with 40 years of shared work between him and the machine. Oliver didn't have terms of service. It didn't have a software update. The only thing it asked of Earl Tatum was oil and fuel and attention, and it had been asking for those same 3 things for 44 years, and Earl had always provided them. The spring of 2022 came early to central Illinois. The ground warmed up 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the planting window opened in late March, which meant that by the first week of April, every farmer in the county was in his field. There was a pressure to those days that Earl recognized from 50 years of spring seasons, the particular urgency of ground that is ready and weather that is cooperating, and the knowledge that both conditions are temporary and the work has to be done now. Bert Hollander had 3 of his 7 tractors in the field on the morning of Tuesday, April 12th. His newest machines, the ones he'd bought in 2020, were in the south fields running the corn planter. His older machines were in the north fields finishing the tillage that the wet March had delayed. His operators were in contact by radio and everything was moving. At 7:48 in the morning, Bert's phone rang. It was one of his operators. The man said his tractor had stopped. Bert said what happened. The operator said it just stopped. Bert said what the screen said. The operator was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It says software update required." Bert said, "Okay, so run the update." The operator said, "It won't run. It says it needs to connect to the dealer network to verify the update." Bert said so. The operator said, "It's trying, but there's no signal." Bert drove out to the field. The tractor was sitting in the middle of a row with the planter still in the ground. The screen showed a progress bar that hadn't moved. It said, "Verifying update. Please wait. Connecting to the dealer network. Signal strength, none." Bert called the John Deere dealer in Decatur. The service manager told him the company had pushed a mandatory firmware update to all connected machines in the region. The update required verification through the dealer's secure server. Without verification, the machines would not operate. The signal issue was a local cell tower problem that had been going on since the previous evening. The dealer expected it to be resolved within the day. Bert said his planting window was open and he needed to be in the field. The service manager said he understood. He said there was nothing he could do from his end. The verification had to happen through the network, and the network needed the cell tower. Bert said how long. The service manager said he'd been told the tower would be back up by afternoon. He said it might be sooner. It was not sooner. The tower had suffered a hardware failure, not just a weather outage. The repair crew that arrived that afternoon found that the damage was more extensive than the initial report had indicated. They said the repair would take 2 to 3 days. By noon on Tuesday, all 17 of the county's connected John Deere tractors were parked. Some of them had been in the middle of rows. Some had been turning on headlands. One of them had been in a field that was too wet to drive on, and the owner couldn't move it without sinking it deeper. All 17 machines, representing somewhere between $3 and $4 million worth of equipment, were sitting in fields doing nothing, waiting for a cell tower in Macon County to be repaired. Bert Hollander stood at the edge of his south field that afternoon and looked at 2 of his tractors parked 100 yards apart, their green paint catching the April sun, their screens still showing the same message they'd been showing since morning. He had 900 acres of corn to plant. His window was 10 days if the weather held. He had already lost 1 day. He started making phone calls to other dealers, to rental companies, to farmers in neighboring counties. Every dealer in the region had the same problem. The update had gone out region-wide. Every connected John Deere in 4 counties was locked. The rental companies had nothing with wheels available. The farmers in neighboring counties were dealing with their own spring schedules and couldn't spare equipment. At 4:30 that afternoon, Bert Hollander did something he had not done in 12 years. He drove down the section road to Earl Tatum's farm. Let me tell you about that conversation, because it is the heart of this story. Earl was in his barn when Bert's truck pulled in. He was lubricating the planter bearings, the same task he did every spring before he put the planter in the ground. He heard the truck, finished the bearing he was on, wiped his hands, and walked out. Bert got out of his truck. He was 61 years old, a big man, broad across the shoulders, the kind of farmer who had spent 40 years doing physical work and looked it. He had not been to Earl's farm since 2009 when he'd borrowed a post driver. They were not unfriendly, but they were not close. Their farming philosophies had been moving in opposite directions for a long time, and both of them knew it. Bert said, "Earl, I've got a situation." Earl said, "I heard." Bert looked at him. Earl said the word travels fast in a county of 23 farms. He said he'd heard about the software update from Dennis Kraft at the elevator around 2 in the afternoon. Bert said, "How much of your ground is in?" Earl said none of it. He said he was planning to start Thursday. His ground ran a little cooler than Bert's, faced different terrain, and he usually went in 2 or 3 days behind the rest of the county. Had always been that way. The timing suited Oliver's pace. Bert said, "I've got 900 acres of corn that needs to go in. My planters are locked. I've got maybe 8 days of window left if the weather holds." Earl didn't say anything. He looked at Bert for a moment and then looked at his barn where Oliver was parked and the planter was sitting, greased and ready, the way it had been every April since 1984. Bert said, "I know I don't have any right to ask. I know what I've said over the years about the old equipment. I know what I said at the Farm Bureau meeting." He paused. "I need help." Earl said, "How many acres can you plant in a day with 1 tractor?" Bert thought about it. He said with Earl's setup, probably 60 to 70 acres a day if the ground was in good shape. Earl said, "My ground is in good shape, always is." Then Earl said, "I'll start on your south fields tomorrow morning at 6, but I need one thing from you." Bert said, "Name it." Earl said, "When this is over, I want you to come to my barn and I want to show you something and I want you to actually look at it." Bert said, "Okay." Earl said, "Not just look, I want you to think about what you're looking at." Bert said he would. They shook hands. Earl went back to the barn and finished lubricating the planter bearings. April 13th was a Wednesday, and the ground was perfect. The overnight temperature had been 39 degrees and the surface dried out just right, firm enough to support the equipment without compacting, moist enough to close over the seed. Earl was in Bert's south field at 5:58 in the morning, 2 minutes before he said he'd be there, because Earl Tatum had been punctual his entire life and saw no reason to change. Oliver started on the first crank. It always did. He drove past 2 of Bert's locked John Deeres on the way to the starting row. Their screens were still showing the same message, verifying update. Please wait. They had been showing that message for 22 hours. Earl dropped the planter into the ground and started the first row. Oliver did not have GPS. Earl steered it himself, the way he had always steered it, by watching the row he was planting and keeping it parallel to the field edge and correcting small deviations as they developed. It was a skill that took years to develop and that the GPS systems had made seem unnecessary. But Earl had never stopped practicing it. His rows were straight. Not laser straight the way the GPS rows were, but straight in the way that a craftsman's work is straight, the straightness of attention and experience rather than computation. He planted 63 acres that first day. He worked until 7:30 in the evening when the dew started coming down and it was time to stop. He refueled from the can in the back of his truck, checked the planter for any issues, and drove back to his own farm. He had a bowl of soup and went to bed at 9. The cell tower was not fixed on Wednesday. It was not fixed on Thursday either. The repair crew had found a second problem deeper in the system, a component failure that required a part to be shipped from a distribution center in Indianapolis. The part was expected to arrive Friday morning. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Earl planted 68 acres on Thursday. The ground in Bert's north fields was a little heavier, and he had to slow down through 2 wet corners, but the work was steady and Oliver never hesitated. By Thursday evening he had 131 acres in, out of Bert's 900. On Thursday night, Derek Voss, the younger farmer with the $120,000 planter, called Bert to ask if he'd found any equipment. Bert told him about Earl. Derek was quiet for a moment and then said, "The old Oliver?" Bert said yes. Derek said, "How fast can he go?" Bert said 60 to 70 acres a day. Derek said, "My planting window is closing." Bert said he knew. Derek said, "Do you think Earl would help me too?" Bert called Earl. Earl said he had his own ground to get in starting Saturday, but that he could do a few hours on Derek's field Friday afternoon after finishing in Bert's fields. He said Derek should have his ground ready and his seed in the right spot. Derek Voss had the seed waiting at the edge of the field when Earl came through on Friday afternoon. He was 29 years old and had never seen an Oliver 8080 working at full pace in a field. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and watched Earl make pass after pass, the old green tractor moving steady and deliberate, the planter laying seed in the ground, the hydraulics working, nothing computerized, nothing connected, just a man and a machine doing a job. At one point, Derek walked out to where Earl had stopped at the end of a row to check the seed depth. Derek looked at the planter and then at the tractor and then at Earl. He said, "How long have you had this thing?" Earl said, "Since 1984. Derek said, "It's never been locked out by a software update." Earl said, "I don't know what software is. Now I want to stop here and ask you something. I want you to think about what we're really talking about, because this isn't just a story about tractors. It's a story about ownership. About what it means to truly own something versus what it means to hold something that a corporation can reach from 1,100 miles away and stop with a software command." Earl Tatum owned his Oliver. He owned it completely. There was no manufacturer that could tell it to stop. There was no update it was required to verify. There was no terms of service that gave someone else the right to interrupt his work at the worst possible time. When Earl put the key in that tractor, it started. When he needed it to move, it moved. That is what ownership is supposed to mean. If you've been thinking about your own situation, about the equipment you run and who really controls it when things go sideways, this might be the time to have that conversation with yourself. If you found this story useful, share it with a farmer you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one, and the farmers in them deserve to be heard. The cell tower came back online at 10:47 on Friday morning. The repair crew installed the replacement part, ran the tests, and within 4 minutes of the tower going live, the locked tractors across 4 counties began completing their software verifications. The screens changed from the waiting message to a completion confirmation, and one by one the machines were ready to operate again. Bert Hollander was in his south field when it happened. He watched his nearest locked tractor complete its verification, heard the engine note change as the control systems came back online, and walked over and climbed in and drove it 50 feet forward just to confirm it was working. It was working. 4 days and approximately 14 hours after the update had locked every connected machine in the county, the machines were free. Bert called Earl. Earl was in the middle of a row in Bert's north field. He let the call go to voicemail and finished the row, checked the planter at the end, and then listened to the message. Bert said the tower was back up and his machines were running. He said Earl should finish the morning if he wanted, and then they'd take it from there. He said Earl had planted 263 acres of his 900 in 4 days. He said thank you. Earl finished the morning. He planted 40 more acres in Bert's north field, working until noon, and then he drove Oliver back down the section road to his own farm. He'd start on his own ground in the afternoon. His window was still good. He'd lose a few days, but the soil temperature was cooperating. That afternoon, while Earl was planting his own ground, something happened that none of the men involved had expected. Word had gotten around the county about what Earl had done. Not because Earl had said anything, he hadn't, he never did, but because Bert had told the story at the elevator and Derek Voss had told it to 3 other farmers, and the story had that quality that honest accounts of remarkable things always have when they travel through communities of people who know what they're looking at. It traveled fast, and it didn't lose anything in the telling. 3 farmers came to Earl's field that Friday afternoon. They parked their trucks at the edge and watched him work for a while. One of them was a man named Calvin Marsh, who farmed 400 acres on the east side of the county and whose 2 John Deere tractors had been locked since Tuesday morning. Calvin had been able to borrow a machine from his brother-in-law in the next county, but had lost 3 days and was behind. Calvin stood at the field edge and watched Oliver make its turns. Then he walked out and flagged Earl down at the end of a row. He said, "Earl, how do you keep that thing running?" Earl said, "I'll take care of it." Calvin said, "No, I mean, how is it still running? It's 45 years old." Earl turned off the engine. The field got quiet the way fields get quiet in April, with the birds and the wind and the smell of fresh-turned soil. He said, "My father told me something when I was young. He said there are 2 kinds of machines that work for you and machines that you work for. He said to always buy the first kind and avoid the second kind." Calvin said, "The new machines are supposed to work for us. That's the whole point. They do everything automatically." Earl said, "They do everything automatically until they don't. And when they don't, you don't have any say in when they start again." Calvin looked at Oliver for a moment. He said, "I spent $180,000 on 2 tractors I couldn't run for 4 days." Earl said, "I know." Calvin said, "What would you have done differently if you were me starting over?" Earl thought about it. He said, "I'd have asked one question before I signed anything." Calvin said, "What question?" Earl said, "Can I fix this myself if it breaks? And can it be stopped by someone who isn't me?" He said, "If the answer to the first is no and the answer to the second is yes, I'd keep looking." Calvin nodded slowly. He said, "The dealer never presented it that way." Earl said, "No, they wouldn't." He started Oliver again and went back to his row. Let me tell you about the evening of Friday, April 15th, because this is the part of the story that matters most, the part that doesn't have anything to do with tractors or software or planting windows. It has to do with what one generation knows and what the next generation has forgotten, and what happens when the forgetting becomes too expensive to ignore. Bert Hollander came to Earl's farm at 6:30 that evening, as he'd promised. Earl was cleaning the planter, washing the seed discs down with a garden hose, the same thing he did every time he came out of the field. Bert parked his truck and walked over and stood next to Earl and watched him work. When Earl was done, he said, "Come in the barn." They walked into the barn. Earl turned on the overhead light, a single bulb on a cord that had been hanging in that same spot since Earl's father had put it there in 1963. The Oliver was parked to one side. The planter was hitched to it. On the other side of the barn, on wooden shelves that ran the full length of the wall, was a collection of parts, belts and bearings and hydraulic fittings and injection pump components and filter elements and gaskets and seals, organized by system and labeled in Earl's handwriting. Bert looked at the shelves. Earl said, "Everything on those shelves is something I can put on this tractor myself. Everything on those shelves came off one that I took off and put a new one on. I know where every part on this machine came from, and I know how to replace every one of them." Bert said, "You have a parts inventory for a 45-year-old tractor." Earl said, "I have a parts inventory for a machine that I own. Every part on those shelves was bought and paid for. None of them require a software verification to install. None of them stop working because a cell tower in the next county went down." Bert was quiet. Earl said, "Do you know what's in those shelves for your tractors?" Bert said, "The dealer handles the parts." Earl said, "I know. That's what I'm talking about." He walked to Oliver and put his hand on the hood. He said, "My grandfather bought the farm in 1922. Depression came, 1929. Banks started calling loans. A lot of farmers in this county lost everything. My grandfather didn't. You know why?" Bert said he didn't. Earl said, "Because he owned his equipment outright and could fix it himself. When the banks stopped lending and the dealers stopped taking trade and nobody had cash for repairs, my grandfather kept farming because his machinery worked and he knew how to keep it working. He didn't need permission from anyone. He didn't need a network signal. He needed oil and fuel and his own two hands." Bert said, "The Depression isn't coming back." Earl said, "No, but something else always comes. It's always something different, and it's always something nobody predicted. In 2008 it was credited. In 2020 it was the supply chain. In 2022 it was a software update and a cell tower. It's always something." He looked at Bert. "The question is whether you own your equipment when it comes, or whether someone else does." Bert stood in the barn for a long time looking at the parts shelves and Oliver and the planter. He said, "I've got 7 tractors and I can't fix any of them myself." Earl said, "I know." Bert said, "I've been farming this county for 35 years and I handed over the right to control my own equipment to a company in Illinois and I didn't even read the terms of service." Earl said, "I know that too." Bert said, "What do I do now?" Earl said, "What you're doing right now. You're thinking about it. That's where it starts. Now I want to tell you about what happened in that county in the months that followed, because the story of those 4 days in April didn't end when the cell tower came back online. It ended differently. It ended the way all stories of this kind end, with the kind of change that happens slowly and without announcement, one decision at a time, across a community that had finally been shown something it could not unsee. Bert Hollander sold 2 of his 7 John Deere tractors in the summer of 2022. He didn't make a speech about it, he didn't post about it anywhere. He just decided that 7 connected tractors was too many eggs in one basket, and that his operation needed something that could work without a network connection. He bought a 1978 International Harvester 1460 from a retiring farmer in the next county. He paid $11,000 for it. He spent a weekend in Earl's barn learning how to check the hydraulics and adjust the injection timing. Derek Voss read his equipment's terms of service in May of 2022. He read all 43 pages of it. He said later that the experience was like finding out that the house you'd been living in for 3 years had rooms you didn't know about. He found a clause that said the manufacturer retained the right to disable the machine remotely in the event of certain service contract terms being violated. He didn't know what those terms were. He had to read another 20 pages to find them, and when he did, he wasn't sure they were specific enough to mean anything in particular, which was, he said, the most troubling part. Vague terms give someone else a lot of room to decide what they mean. Calvin Marsh didn't sell his John Deeres, but he started keeping a notebook. He wrote down every question he hadn't known to ask when he bought the machines, every clause in the terms of service he didn't understand. Every function of the tractor required a network connection to operate. He took the notebook to his bank and had a conversation with his loan officer about whether the equipment was truly an asset if it could be disabled remotely under certain conditions. The loan officer didn't have an answer. But the question had been asked, and questions like that, once asked, don't stop being asked. Earl Tatum planted his own 160 acres starting Saturday, April 16th, 5 days behind his usual schedule. The ground was still good. The temperature stayed cooperative. He finished in 4 days, which was fast for him but not unusual. Oliver worked every hour he asked it to work. It did not ask for anything in return except oil and fuel and attention. When the planting was done, Earl parked the tractor in the barn and shut the door. He did the same thing he did every year after planting. He wrote down the date in a small notebook he kept on a shelf above his workbench. He wrote down how many acres he'd planted and how many hours the tractor had run. He noted any issues he'd seen or any maintenance that was coming due. He'd been keeping that notebook since 1984. There were 12 of them on that shelf, each one full. The most recent entry read, April 19th. Planting complete. 160 own ground. 263 Bert Hollander. 40 Derek Voss. Total season, 463 acres. Oliver is running well. No issues. Change oil before fall tillage. 463 acres. With a tractor that had been built in 1979, while 17 connected machines sat locked in their fields waiting for a signal. I want to leave you with something Earl said in September of 2022. He was talking to a group of younger farmers at a county extension meeting. He had not planned to speak. He was there to listen, the same as always. But one of the younger farmers asked directly what he thought the lesson of April was, and Earl answered. He said, "The lesson isn't that new technology is bad. It isn't that you shouldn't use GPS or precision planting or any of the tools that help you farm better. The technology can be extraordinary. The lesson is about ownership." He said, "When you own something, you have the last word on when it works and when it stops. When you don't own something, somebody else has that word." And the question you have to ask yourself, before you sign anything, before you take on the debt, before you let the dealer show you the features, is this. In the worst moment, when everything is going sideways and the window is closing and I need this machine to move, who has the last word? Me or someone else? He said, if the answer is someone else, that's not ownership. That's a long-term rental with a payment plan. The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the younger farmers said, "What about Oliver? What happens when it wears out and you can't get parts anymore?" Earl said, "I've been getting parts for it for 45 years. Some of them I make. Some of them I find at farm sales. Some of them I order from specialty suppliers who still make them. It's never stopped me from planting." He paused. The question isn't whether it'll wear out eventually. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Everything wears out. The question is whether I'll have a warning when it does, and whether I'll have a say in what happens next. He said, with Oliver, I get both. With a machine that can be updated by someone 1,100 miles away, I'm not sure I get either. He went back to his seat. The cell tower in Macon County was repaired and running. The software update on 17 John Deere tractors had been verified. The spring planting season of 2022 was over. The corn and soybeans were in the ground, most of them, and the summer was beginning. In Earl Tatum's barn, behind the wooden door on the sliding track that his grandfather had hung in 1922, The Oliver 8080 sat in the dark, fueled, lubricated, maintained, ready. It didn't know about the software update. It didn't know about the cell tower. It didn't know about the 4 days that had changed how the farmers in that county thought about ownership and control and what it means to truly rely on something. It just knew how to start when you turned the key. And after 45 years of being owned by a man who understood what ownership meant, that was still the most important thing a tractor could know. There is a lesson in that barn. There is a lesson in those 12 notebooks on the shelf above the workbench, each one full of dates and acres and maintenance notes and the quiet, steady record of a man who kept his word to his equipment and received the same in return. The lesson is not complicated. It is the same lesson Earl's father learned, and the same lesson he taught to Earl, and the same lesson that 4 days in April showed to a county that had forgotten it. You cannot farm ground you don't own. You cannot work with a machine that someone else controls. And you cannot build anything that lasts if the foundation of it requires a signal from a satellite to stand up. Earl Tatum knew that. He'd known it since 1978 when he'd walked into Harlan Peck's dealership and bought a tractor that asked nothing of him except his attention. Oliver is still in that barn. It will be there next April, and the April after that. And when spring comes and the ground is ready and the window is open, Earl Tatum will turn the key, and the old diesel will start, and the machine that asks permission from no one will go back to work. The same as it always has. The same as it always will. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are farmers in every county who are one software update away from the same 4 days. And there are stories like Earl's in every county too. Stories of quiet men and old machines and decisions made 40 years ago that are still paying dividends today. We find those stories. We tell them here. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. And if you've got a story of your own about an old machine that kept running when the new ones stopped, drop it in the comments. We read all of them. The land is still there. The work is still there. And the old ways, when they're built on principle and not just habit, still have something to teach us all.